Have you seen people talk about trauma and found yourself wondering, what is trauma really? What is childhood trauma? How do you know if you've experienced it? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Welcome. I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you so much for joining me. So it is everywhere, and that's a good thing. It is really good that people are talking about trauma in general, and it's really good that people are talking about childhood trauma. But it can sometimes feel a little confusing because people have different ideas of what trauma really is. So I want to share with you my perspective as somebody who works with childhood trauma survivors, what that means for me. So again, if you're watching this video, then you likely have an interest in childhood trauma and you're interested in really understanding what that means. So that's what I'm going to focus on. So I think it is helpful to a degree to be able to recognize that experiencing trauma as an adult, there's a lot of differences than experiencing it as a child. Now, of course, there's going to be some similarities, but there really are a lot of differences. And when I talk about finding somebody to help you heal, I will often be very specific about finding somebody who has experience and understanding in working with childhood trauma survivors. And the reason for that is because when it comes to childhood trauma, so much of what is important to understand for the person helping you is the complexity of what it means to experience those types of things as a child with a developing mind, as a child who has no real power or control over their lives, which is a very different experience than an adult who is going to experience trauma. It doesn't mean that an adult can't be also equally as affected potentially. And it's not because they're weak or because they're childlike or anything like that, but there's a lot more complexity in terms of how you experience it, how you internalize it, and what it takes to heal it if you experience it as a child. Another factor that is really important to understand is that much of childhood trauma, when we talk about healing childhood trauma, certainly the things that I'm talking about, and I would say that probably most people talk about when they're talking about childhood trauma, we're talking about ongoing chronic types of situations. So it's not like a car accident and everything else in their life was great, but they got in a car accident at 5, even if, let's say, nobody got seriously hurt or anything, we wouldn't necessarily refer to that as childhood trauma. I mean, yes, it was trauma as a child, and that's important to recognize the age of the child developmentally, but most childhood trauma is something that people experience ongoing, maybe even by different perpetrators. But so much of childhood trauma happens in an environment that is conducive for that child to continue to experience really difficult and challenging things. So even if we think about a child growing up in poverty and in a community that doesn't necessarily feel very safe, that child is in that environment day after day after day after day. And even if there are some good things sprinkled throughout, if that child doesn't get to eat every day, if that child doesn't have what they need for school, and that's an ongoing problem, that creates deeper impact. The meaning that's attached to that becomes bigger because it's an ongoing type of situation. And if their community is unsafe, even if nothing specifically happens to them, just the awareness that something could happen or something could happen to somebody that they love, that is a chronic stress. So even the poverty aspect and not having enough food to eat all the time, that is a chronic stress that even if you're not consciously thinking about it, is just a part of your regular everyday life. Now, of course, for most of the people watching this, there's a good chance that the trauma that you might be thinking of is ongoing physical, emotional, sexual abuse. And even on days when the abuse isn't happening, especially if the person abusing you is somebody that you have frequent contact with or even live with, maybe even especially live with, part of the reason that it is so impactful is because you never know. We've heard people talk about this sometimes when they talk about living with like an alcoholic, like a mean alcoholic. Like you never know, is today going to be the day? And when you are growing up in a home where you're being physically, emotionally, or sexually abused, again, it could be happening just periodically, but you never know when it's going to happen. And so you live from this place of, is today the day? And you don't have to consciously be thinking about it because your body is already on guard. Your body is preparing you for that. So you really live in this chronic state of increased stress. And trauma is a stress response, post-traumatic stress, right? It is a stress response that it creates in our body. Even the freeze response is a stress response. So childhood trauma can be a lot of things. So what you hear me talk about mostly is childhood sexual abuse. And that can mean so many different things. And I'm not going to talk specifically or solely about that right now. But a lot of people tend to think that it means that you have to be raped. Whatever that might mean to any one person, but that's kind of the idea. Repeatedly or even just once. But sexual abuse, there's a whole spectrum of experiences and behaviors that are part of what it means to be sexually abused. But there's sexual abuse, there's physical abuse, emotional abuse, and that can look a lot of different ways too. It could be a little bit more obvious where somebody is just incredibly like mean or cruel to you, says really nasty, hurtful things, calls you names, that sort of thing. But emotional abuse can also, neglect can kind of fall into an emotional abuse, even without anything specifically having to happen, because it affects you on a very emotional level. Neglect, where your needs are not met, where your emotional needs are not met, your physical needs are not met, and you may not have any idea consciously that your needs are not being met. But if your needs are not being met, then that is neglect. And it could be that somebody isn't paying attention to you, and there could be any number of reasons that that could be the case. It could be that your physical needs are not being met. But so many of the people that I have known and worked with over the years, their emotional needs are not met. And that could be for a number of reasons. And in all reality, even if you're growing up in a pretty healthy home and you're being abused by somebody outside of the home, and you never tell anybody that you're being abused, your emotional needs are not being met. So like if you are kind of withdrawn and your parent says to you, what's wrong? Or maybe gets mad at you because you're not doing the things that you're supposed to be doing. The experience of that is harmful because you can't tell them why you're upset or why you're struggling. And so your needs are not being met. And it's not that that parent is neglecting you, but your needs are still not being met. And that creates incredible wounding, even if it's not deliberate or there's any awareness on either part that that's happening. But when your needs are not met as a child, your emotional needs, including your physical needs, of course, but your emotional needs, your need to be felt, the needs that you have to be able to experience your own feelings, the needs that you have to be seen, to be heard, to be loved. All of those things are part of what helps you feel that you matter. It helps build your confidence as a child and well into your adult life. So all of those pieces can have an impact. Growing up in poverty can be an aspect of kind of neglect, emotional type of experience, trauma. It's not abuse specifically, but it can be a trauma. Growing up in severe poverty is definitely traumatic to live in, when you don't know if you're going to have food, you don't know if you're going to have running water. Those kinds of things create that chronic heightened stress. Growing up in a community that feels unsafe is traumatic. It creates a traumatic response. So there are a lot of factors there. Another one is, and remember that, so that's a chronic type of situation, right? That's not just a one-time event. All of that is chronic. Another example of a chronic type of experience could be like if you've got, as a young child in particular, a teacher who is really like singles out certain students, is really cruel, or maybe a coach or something like that, and can just be really hurtful in some way. That obviously affects you in the moment that it happens. But again, you don't know when it's going to happen. You don't know if it's going to happen today. You don't know if it's going to happen in the morning or in the afternoon. And so you've got that chronic stress response going on because you're preparing for that to happen. You're anticipating it happening. So it can look a lot of different ways. One of the things that has come up a lot in my work is that people often, and part of this is about coping, people often discount their experiences. And they will say, well, it wasn't that bad. It could have been worse. Well, it was just this person. It wasn't that person. Or it only happened for a year. Any number of things, people will find a way to discount it. And when it comes to abuse, people will often have an idea that what they're experiencing is not. It is not that. Okay, yeah, it wasn't good, but it's not that. And again, that's partly how we cope, by minimizing it or denying the reality of it. So often what ends up happening when I'm working with somebody, or even like in a group or something like that, is that people will say that what happened to them wasn't really that bad because it could have been worse. And the danger in that, well, there's probably a few, but one of the dangers in regards to healing is that when you tell yourself it wasn't that bad, you're telling yourself you shouldn't really be affected by it. When you're telling yourself you shouldn't be really affected by it, then you are judging, criticizing, or shaming yourself because you struggle. Right? How many times have you found yourself saying something to yourself along the lines of, it was so long ago, why am I still struggling? Or it could have been so much worse. Why is this still affecting me? Why can't I get over it? Other people have it so much worse and they seem to be doing so much better. What is wrong with me? So when you're judging or shaming yourself, you're adding more layers. You're reinforcing those beliefs that there's something wrong with you. You're telling yourself that you're weak because you're struggling, and you really shouldn't be, because it's not that bad. So anything, particularly when it comes to abuse, or how you grew up as a child, anything that made you feel chronic fear, uncertainty, doubt about who you are. Call it whatever you want, but that is going to have a significant impact on what you believe about who you are. And that chronic stress, if you think about it as an adult, when you've had something happen, like maybe there was a near miss with a car accident, or something that just kind of immediately scared you, and you think about that response that happens in your body, right? That immediate adrenaline rush and how that feels. As a child, again, your whole entire being is still developing. You're learning how to manage stress, ideally in a safe environment, but for most people watching this, that probably wasn't the case, at least not completely. So when you experience these situations that are so confusing, so hurtful, so difficult to try to understand, where there is betrayal, your body responds to that. And it may not feel like what I just mentioned, where you feel that adrenaline rush, but there is a stress response that happens in your body. And again, when it's chronic, when you are living with that person or have to see that person all the time, or are in that environment where bad things might be happening, that anticipatory experience keeps your stress level, so the cortisol in your body, it keeps that level high, right? When we normally, like, we're here and we have a stressful situation, our stress cortisol goes up and then it comes back down. As a child in that situation, first of all, your body doesn't have enough practice to do that, right? Or to recognize that that's the pattern. So you can feel kind of safe, like, okay, I'm going to feel better. It's going to go away. I'm going to be fine. As a child, you don't have enough experience with that. So your body doesn't know. So the stress level goes up and then it stays up. And that is part of the reason why childhood, like when you think of the ACEs score for childhood trauma, why there is such a strong link from childhood trauma to so many medical conditions. Because you've lived your entire life with that increased level of stress. So when it comes to your struggle, I think it can be important to acknowledge the reality of your experience. So if you've experienced trauma, I think that it's important to be able to acknowledge that. But you don't have to name it trauma. You don't have to experience trauma in order to be deeply affected by things in your environment growing up. Again, especially ongoing. One of the things that children can be deeply affected by is moving a lot. And if it's because of poverty, which was the case for me, that was challenging on both levels, right? Poverty and having to move a lot and starting new schools and all of that. But for a lot of people, they move a lot because maybe one of their parents is in the military, or one of their parents has another kind of job where they have to move to different places a lot. So it's not really a bad thing, right, by itself. But the stress of that, the stress of leaving friends and finding new friends, having to get accustomed to new things, the uncertainty of what it's going to be like in a new place, that when you have to do that over and over again, that can create a lot of different types of issues. It can create issues around fear of abandonment. It can make you feel like you don't want to connect or really attach to people, because what's the point? You're just going to have to end the relationship anyway, or it's somehow going to end. You may not want to stay in one particular place for very long, which can potentially create other issues for you. So it doesn't necessarily matter what you refer to it as as long as you're able to acknowledge and honor the reality of your experiences and the impact that it has on you, so that you can heal whatever that might be. And also to kind of validate, which is incredibly healing, that if you're struggling with some things, there's likely a really good reason for that. It's not just because you're crazy. Well, it's not because you're crazy at all, but like in your mind, it's not because you're crazy. It's not because you're weak. It's not because of whatever else you've tried to make yourself believe as to why you struggle. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments. If you found this helpful, make sure to give it a thumbs up. I really do appreciate it. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and click the bell for notifications. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.